The grand ballroom of Silverwood Crest, an imposing estate nestled along the rugged cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, gleamed with the cold brilliance of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. Tall windows looked out over the dark, churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean, reflecting the opulent scene inside where the elite of high society gathered in their finest silks and velvet. Waiters moved seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays laden with expensive vintage wines and delicate hors d'oeuvres, while a live orchestra played a hauntingly beautiful waltz that echoed against the vaulted ceilings. Yet, despite the overwhelming display of wealth and luxury, an invisible wall of ice seemed to divide the room into two entirely different worlds. At the center of this magnificent gathering stood Benedict Montgomery, the undisputed master of the estate and the ancient vampire king whose family had ruled the shadows of the region for centuries. Benedict remained seated in a high-backed chair of carved ebony, positioned near a massive marble pillar where he could observe the festivities without directly joining them. His appearance was nothing short of striking, characterized by silken strands of snow-white hair that fell elegantly around his sharp features and a complexion so pale it resembled flawless porcelain. He wore a tailored midnight black suit that contrasted sharply with his otherworldly coloring, marking him as a figure of immense power and absolute authority. For hundreds of years, his name had commanded absolute respect and terrifying reverence throughout the mortal and immortal realms alike. On this particular evening, however, the respect he was accustomed to receiving felt hollow, replaced by a suffocating, collective indifference from the very people he had invited into his home. A year prior, this identical ballroom had been alive with genuine laughter, warm handshakes, and influential figures eagerly competing for a mere moment of Benedict's precious time. Wealthy merchants, politicians, and high-ranking immortals had crowded around his seat, hanging on to his every word and seeking his powerful favor with practiced smiles. But tonight, a strange and silent shift had taken place among the guests, as if a tacit agreement had been made to treat the white-haired king as nothing more than a ghost. As Benedict watched the crowd, he noticed how the lively conversations would suddenly drop in volume whenever his cool gaze drifted in their direction. People turned their backs with practiced elegance, deliberately steering their companions away from his corner of the room to avoid any direct interaction. The vampire king did not utter a single word of complaint, nor did he allow his expression to betray the profound loneliness creeping into his immortal heart. He merely observed the subtle movements of the room, recognizing that this elaborate dinner party had transformed from a celebration into a cruel psychological test. He had hosted this gathering specifically to determine whether the devotion he had received for centuries was truly meant for him as an individual or simply for the immense influence he wielded. He watched as a young waiter approached his table with a tray of crystal goblets, hesitated for a fraction of a second upon meeting Benedict's piercing eyes, and then quickly turned away to serve a group of laughing aristocrats. Benedict tightened his pale fingers against the smooth armrests of his ebony chair, the quiet rejection settling heavily in his chest. A few paces away from his solitary perch, two prominent city officials stood close together, swirling their dark wine, while conversing in hushed, secretive tones that they assumed were safe from human ears. They did not realize that Benedict's supernatural senses allowed him to hear their words with crystal clarity over the loud swells of the orchestral music. One of the men murmured that the great vampire king had grown distant, refusing to sign new trade charters or engage in the politics of the city, while the other replied that power always fades when one spends too much time in seclusion. Benedict listened to their dismissive remarks without moving a single muscle, his heart aching not from the criticism itself, but from the realization of how quickly loyalty dissolves when convenience disappears. His mind wandered back to an evening decades ago in this very same hall, a time when he would stand gracefully beneath the chandeliers, moving effortlessly among his guests while offering toasts and sharing genuine smiles. In those days, he possessed an effortless charisma that drew people toward him like moths to a bright flame, making him the absolute center of every social universe he inhabited. Tonight, however, the physical space around his chair seemed to actively expand, creating a vast, empty void that effectively isolated him from the rest of humanity. An old business acquaintance walked directly past his station, their eyes locking for one brief, intense second before the man nervously looked away, pretending to be deeply engrossed in a conversation across the room. Benedict did not offer a dramatic reaction to the slight. He merely closed his eyes for a moment and breathed in the scent of aged cedar and burning wax that filled the air. Around him, the crystal glasses continued to clink merrily. The laughter remained light and superficial, and the music flowed with the exact same mechanical perfection it had possessed at the beginning of the night. The entire event was functioning flawlessly without his participation, proving to him that his presence was entirely irrelevant to the people who enjoyed his hospitality. He understood then that this silent treatment was not born of open hatred or active rebellion, but rather from something far more devastating: absolute indifference. He sat perfectly still, cataloging every averted gaze and every deliberate step away from his seat, recognizing the painful truth of his existence. When the respect of the world is entirely dependent on what a ruler can provide, it ceases to be genuine respect and reveals itself as mere opportunistic interest. Benedict Montgomery was facing the cold reality that his centuries of generosity had bought him nothing but fair-weather companions who feared his power but cared nothing for his soul. He whispered to himself in the quiet sanctuary of his thoughts that tonight would be the ultimate revelation, a moment to definitively learn who valued his existence and who had simply been wearing a mask of devotion. He had resolved to retreat into the shadows of his estate forever after this evening, fully prepared to embrace an eternity of absolute solitude, when an unexpected event shattered the quiet monotony of his isolation. The mesmerizing music continued to float through the air of the grand ballroom, but to Benedict's ears, the melodies had transformed into a distant, meaningless hum that could no longer touch his spirit. He remained frozen beside the heavy marble pillar, treating the dark corner as a protective fortress where he could exist without the burden of forcing polite smiles or enduring the hollow glances of the crowd. Then, without any warning, a sudden disruption broke the carefully orchestrated rhythm of the sophisticated gathering, drawing the attention of a few observant guests near the edge of the room. A small human girl, wearing a simple cotton dress that looked wildly out of place among the expensive silk gowns, slipped away from her mother's side near the service entrance. The child did not hesitate for a single moment, nor did she look around the vast room for permission as she marched directly across the polished floor toward the imposing ebony chair. She did not possess the calculated caution of the aristocrats, nor did she care about the unspoken social rules that kept everyone else at a safe distance from the pale-skinned master of the house. She halted directly in front of Benedict, her bright, innocent eyes looking up at his white hair and striking features without a single trace of fear or hesitation. In a voice that possessed a startling, clear naturalness, she asked him why he was sitting all by himself when the rest of the people were laughing and enjoying the party. The simple question seemed to echo through the immediate area, carrying a weight that completely caught the ancient vampire king off guard. Benedict lifted his head with agonizing slowness, his crimson-tinted eyes widening slightly as he stared down at the brave little human who had dared to address him so directly. It had been decades since anyone had spoken to him with such raw honesty, devoid of the exhausting flattery or the terrified caution that usually colored every conversation initiated by mortals. Nearby, several aristocratic discussions abruptly died down as guests turned to witness the bizarre encounter, their expressions a mix of shock and intense disapproval at the child's breach of upper-class protocol. From the shadows near the kitchen doorways, a human housekeeper named Miriam Cross felt her entire body go rigid with terror as she realized her young daughter had escaped her supervision. Miriam tightly gripped the edges of her white apron, her knuckles turning stark white as she desperately tried to signal the child without causing a loud scene that would offend the wealthy guests. She whispered her daughter's name, Lily, in a frantic attempt to draw her back to the safety of the servants' quarters, but the young girl remained completely focused on the lonely figure before her. Benedict remained silent, his lips parting slightly as he struggled to find a suitable response to a question whose answer was painfully obvious to everyone in the room. The silence stretched between them for several long seconds, heavy with the weight of things left unsaid, until Lily tilted her small head to the side, examining his pale face with deep curiosity. She mentioned softly that her mother had told her stories about how the master of the house used to be incredibly kind, speaking warmly with every single person who visited the estate. The innocent statement struck Benedict deeper than any weapon ever could, causing his pale fingers to tighten against the dark wood of his chair until his knuckles matched the color of his hair. He could hear the judgmental murmurs of the nearby guests, who were quietly questioning who the child belonged to and suggesting that the staff should be reprimanded for allowing such an interruption. Lily paid absolutely no attention to the critical whispers of the wealthy crowd. Instead, she took a brave step closer to the ebony throne and extended her small, warm hand toward the Vampire King. With a bright, hopeful smile, she looked up at him and confidently offered to dance with him so that he wouldn't have to spend the rest of the beautiful evening sitting alone. The entire ballroom seemed to lose its breath at that exact moment, plunging into a profound, suffocating silence as every eye focused on the small hand suspended in the air. Some of the cynical guests waited for Benedict to call his security guards to remove the child, while others expected him to deliver a cold, polite refusal that would send her away. Benedict simply stared at the tiny hand, noting the incredible contrast between her warm, vibrant human skin and his own pale, immortal form that had not felt the true warmth of companionship in centuries. There was no deceit in her extended palm, no hidden agenda, and no desire to gain political favor or wealth from the ruler of the night. She was simply offering him a moment of genuine human connection. He raised his eyes to meet hers once more, finding nothing but absolute sincerity and a total absence of the pity that he loathed above all else. The sheer purity of her gesture managed to disarm the ancient king, cracking the thick wall of emotional ice he had spent lifetimes building around his heart. He hesitated to move, not out of a fear of being rejected by a child, but because he understood that accepting her invitation would mean acknowledging his own deep emotional vulnerability. To take her hand meant admitting to himself, and to the entire room of judgmental onlookers, that the powerful vampire king was indeed lonely and still desired the comfort of a kindred spirit. He drew in a slow, steady breath as the orchestra continued to play a softer, more delicate melody that seemed to fill the expectant space between them. Lily did not grow impatient or withdraw her hand. She merely waited with an absolute confidence that made it completely impossible for Benedict to turn her away. The tension in the grand ballroom reached a fever pitch as the guests watched the silent standoff between the powerful master of Silverwood Crest and the innocent child of a housekeeper. Benedict remained completely motionless for a few more seconds, his brilliant white hair catching the light of the chandeliers as he made a final internal choice. With a movement that was incredibly deliberate and graceful, he reached out his pale, long-fingered hand and gently allowed it to rest against Lily's small, warm palm. A collective, quiet murmur rippled through the elegant crowd, a sound born not from pleasant surprise, but from a deep, underlying social discomfort at the unconventional sight. Lily's smile widened into a brilliant expression of pure triumph as she felt his cool fingers close around hers, and she gently guided him away from his isolated throne toward the center of the floor. Benedict stood up from his chair, his tall, imposing figure commanding the attention of every soul in the room as he allowed himself to be led by a child. The conductor of the orchestra, watching the unusual development with keen eyes, immediately signaled his musicians to soften their instruments, shifting the music into a slow, gentle rhythm that perfectly matched the slow steps of the pair. They moved onto the pristine marble floor, a space that the wealthy adults had completely abandoned the moment the Vampire King stepped forward. Lily began to move with small, rhythmic steps, keeping time with the music with a natural grace that suggested she was completely at home in the vastness of the beautiful ballroom. Benedict followed her lead with extraordinary care, adjusting his long strides to match her tiny movements and ensuring that he did not accidentally step on her simple cotton dress. He did not attempt to put on a grand performance for the watching crowd, nor did he feign a happiness he did not feel. He simply allowed himself to be present in the moment. The initial movements were stiff and precise, but as they completed a slow turn beneath the center chandelier, Benedict felt the heavy tension begin to drain from his shoulders. Across the room, wealthy women lowered their crystal glasses in sheer astonishment, while their husbands stopped their quiet political discussions to stare at the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. The grand dance floor, which had been crowded with spinning couples only 20 minutes earlier, now belonged entirely to an ancient vampire ruler and a little human girl. It was not a display of high society choreography or aristocratic elegance, but rather an authentic dance of mutual respect that no amount of money or social status could ever replicate. Benedict felt the change within his own body, his breathing becoming deeper and more relaxed than it had been in over a century of solitary living. Lily looked up at his pale face as they spun slowly, her voice filled with an innocent curiosity as she reminded him of what her mother had said about his past generosity. Benedict did not answer her immediately. He chose instead to focus on the soft sound of her shoes scraping against the smooth marble, a sound that felt infinitely more real than the fake laughter of his guests. The memory of his younger years flashed through his mind, a time when he believed that his immense wealth and political power would bring him a lifetime of loyal friends and meaningful connections. He brought his focus back to the present moment, looking down at the small child who was treating him like a human being rather than a terrifying entity. Without a single trace of malice or social awareness, Lily softly asked him if he had any children of his own to share the massive, beautiful house with. The innocent question caused Benedict's movements to falter for one brief second, a subtle pause that was instantly noticed by the sharpest observers among the aristocratic guests. He felt a familiar coldness attempt to reassert itself within his chest, but it was quickly washed away by a wave of profound, reflective sorrow for the choices he had made. He did not think about his vast financial empires or his family name. He thought only of the quiet decades he had wasted, the relationships he had avoided, and the walls he had built. He recovered his rhythm with effortless grace, executing a wider, more confident turn that caused Lily to let out a delighted laugh as she held onto his pale hand with renewed trust. In that simple, echoing laughter, Benedict discovered a sense of personal dignity that had absolutely nothing to do with his royal title or his supernatural abilities. It was the pure dignity that emerges when one realizes they are worthy of companionship simply for who they are, rather than what they can provide to the world. The music continued to wrap around them, but the atmosphere of the ballroom had been permanently altered, stripping away the comfort of the guests' superficial behavior. The wealthy onlookers could no longer pretend that Benedict was invisible, nor could they look away from the powerful lesson unfolding in the very center of the room. They watched the dance not out of amusement, but because the scene served as a quiet, mirror's edge accusation of their own cowardice and superficiality throughout the evening. Benedict understood their discomfort perfectly, and for the first time in his long, immortal life, he found that he cared absolutely nothing for their opinions or their social approval. The orchestra brought the gentle melody to a slow, lingering finish, the final note hanging suspended in the air like a promise before fading into a deep, conscious silence. The silence that settled over the grand ballroom after the final note faded was heavier and more profound than any applause could ever have been. For several seconds, not a single guest made a move or uttered a sound, as if the entire assembly was trapped in a spell of collective realization. The wealthy individuals remained frozen in their designated places, but the arrogant confidence they had displayed all evening had vanished, replaced by an unsettling awareness of their own flaws. Benedict did not immediately release his gentle grip on Lily's tiny hand. He looked down at her with a soft expression, wishing to preserve the memory of her sincerity. He slowly turned away from the center of the floor, guiding Lily back toward the edge of the room, where a nearby microphone stood ready for evening announcements. An assistant standing by the audio equipment hesitated for a brief second, looking into the king's ancient eyes before quickly stepping back and adjusting the volume settings. Benedict took the microphone in his pale hand, his movements smooth and devoid of any haste as he prepared to address the room of silent onlookers. He did not avoid a single face this time. Instead, his sharp gaze swept across the crowd, locking onto the very individuals who had spent the night avoiding his presence. He thanked them all for traveling to Newport to attend his annual gathering, his voice smooth and clear as it resonated through the high-ceilinged room. A few of the guests let out a quiet sigh of relief, foolishly assuming that the awkward moment had passed and that the evening would return to its normal, superficial routine. But Benedict paused, allowing the silence to stretch out over the crowd until the comfort they had regained began to wither away under his intense scrutiny. He stated plainly that this elaborate dinner had never been intended as a mere celebration, causing a sudden wave of nervous murmurs to break out among the tables. He revealed to the entire room that the event had been a deliberate test to discover who among his vast network of acquaintances valued him as a person and who was merely present for his status. The silence returned with a terrifying intensity as his words sunk in, causing several prominent figures to look down at the floor in deep, unmitigated shame. Benedict continued in an even, unbended tone, noting how he had walked through the crowd earlier in the evening without a single person offering a toast or engaging him in conversation. He pointed out that many in the room could not even summon the courage to maintain eye contact with him when he passed their tables. As he spoke, several women quietly placed their crystal glasses down onto the white tablecloths, the sharp sound of glass hitting would echoing loudly in the quiet space. No one dared to interrupt his speech because they knew his words were entirely accurate, and they possessed no valid defense for the cold indifference they had displayed. Benedict then turned his pale face slightly toward Lily, who was watching him with a look of innocent wonder, entirely unaware of the social storm he was unleashing. He announced that the only individual in the entire mansion who had shown him true kindness was a child who understood nothing of politics, but everything of basic humanity. Miriam Cross stood a few yards away, her hand pressed against her chest as she listened to the master of the house defend her daughter before the most powerful people in the state. Benedict looked back at the crowd of aristocrats, stating that their collective behavior had given him all the clarity he would ever need regarding the nature of high society. He remarked that while his ancient fortune could easily purchase the superficial respect of the world, it could never buy a single ounce of genuine human compassion. The truth of his statement left the guests completely speechless, stripping away the elegant illusions they used to justify their opportunistic relationships. He gave a small, definitive nod, effectively closing a painful chapter of his long existence that he had allowed to remain open for far too long. He expressed a final, quiet gratitude for their attendance before calmly declaring that the evening had reached its absolute conclusion and that the doors were now open for their departure. It was not shouted in anger, but the absolute finality of his voice left no room for argument or delay from any person present. His assistants immediately moved to open the heavy mahogany exit doors, signaling the waiters to cease their service and clear the remaining tables. Slowly and awkwardly, the wealthy guests began to gather their expensive coats and wraps, moving toward the exits in a quiet, subdued procession that lacked any of their previous arrogance. Some tried to catch Benedict's eye to offer a parting apology, but the white-haired king remained perfectly still, refusing to grant them the comfort of his attention. The sound of hundreds of leather shoes shuffling across the marble floor replaced the beautiful music of the orchestra, a hollow sound that emphasized the emptiness of their departure. Within 20 minutes, the grand ballroom was entirely cleared of its upper-class visitors, leaving behind a vast, quiet space that felt cleaner and more honest than it had in centuries. When the last heavy door finally clicked shut, the silence that filled Silverwood Crest was fundamentally different from the suffocating coldness that had dominated the early evening. Without the burden of forced conversations and artificial laughter, the massive architecture of the mansion seemed to expand, breathing with a newfound sense of peace. Benedict placed the microphone down onto a velvet-covered table, letting out a long, slow breath as if releasing centuries of emotional weight from his immortal chest. He remained in the center of the vast, empty ballroom for a moment, looking at the half-empty glasses and scattered chairs that marked the end of an era. For the first time since his transformation into the Vampire King, he felt absolutely no desire to maintain a flawless, unapproachable image for the benefit of the mortal world. Lily walked over to his side with quiet steps, her small hand brushing against his dark suit as she looked around the empty room with genuine curiosity. She looked up at him and asked in her sweet, clear voice if the big party was officially over for the night. Benedict looked down at her, a rare and genuine smile appearing on his pale face as he confirmed that the gathering was indeed finished and that a beautiful quiet had finally returned. Miriam Cross approached the pair with slow, hesitant steps, her posture still holding a degree of professional caution now that the wealthy guests had completely vacated the premises. She looked at Benedict with wide, apologetic eyes, expressing her deepest regrets for her daughter's lack of discipline and explaining that Lily did not understand the importance of his position. Benedict raised a pale hand to gently cut off her apologies, stating softly that her daughter was actually the only person in the entire house who truly understood what mattered. Miriam fell silent, her eyes softening as she realized the master of the house was not angry, but deeply moved. Benedict made a gentle gesture toward the rear of the mansion, asking Miriam and Lily if they would join him in the private kitchen for a quiet moment away from the formal ballroom. They walked together down the long, dimly lit corridors, leaving behind the gleaming marble and crystal chandeliers for the comfortable warmth of the estate's functional heart. The kitchen was a stark contrast to the rest of the house, featuring a simple oak table, hand-woven chairs, and the comforting, rich aroma of freshly brewed black coffee. Miriam quickly moved to pour a cup for Benedict, her movements natural and practiced after years of dedicated service to the Montgomery family. They sat down together at the wooden table, while Lily immediately claimed a small corner with a piece of scrap paper and a box of colored wax crayons, instantly becoming absorbed in a new drawing. For a few minutes, no one spoke a word, but the silence between the two adults was incredibly comfortable, filled with a mutual respect that did not require grand declarations. Benedict rested his pale hands on the smooth surface of the oak table, interlocking his long fingers as he began to speak about the reality of his long life. He confessed to Miriam that he had spent hundreds of years surrounded by thousands of people, yet he had never felt truly accompanied until this very evening. He explained that after his transition into immortality centuries ago, his perception of humanity and his relationship with himself had undergone a drastic, negative transformation. He had intentionally chosen to become cold, distant, and unyielding, foolishly believing that an emotional fortress would protect him from the pain of watching mortal lives fade away. Lily paused her drawing for a brief second, looking up at the white-haired king with a brilliant flash of understanding before returning to her work with quiet focus. Miriam commented softly that people often build walls to protect their hearts, without ever realizing how much beauty and light they are locking out in the process. Benedict nodded slowly in agreement, acknowledging that tonight had taught him a vital lesson about his own past failures to connect with the world around him. He admitted that he had not actually lost the respect of the community. Rather, he had completely lost the ability to approach people with an open and vulnerable spirit. He paused, his crimson eyes shifting toward the window where the dark Atlantic waves were crashing against the cliffs under the light of a pale moon. He stated with a touch of quiet sorrow that in his endless pursuit of power, he had failed to build a genuine family or a place that felt like a real home. Lily suddenly stood up from her chair and walked over to Benedict, proudly holding up the completed drawing for his immediate inspection. The paper displayed two simple figures standing hand in hand in the center of a giant room. One figure was small and colorful, while the other was tall with distinct white hair, resting beside an inscription that read, "When someone is lonely, you must invite them to dance." Benedict held the fragile piece of paper in his pale hands for a long time, his gaze lingering on the simple lines that captured the entire truth of his existence. He thanked her in a quiet, emotional whisper, carefully placing the drawing on the table as if it were the most valuable treasure in his entire collection. The beautiful drawing remained on the center of the wooden table, acting as a silent catalyst for a conversation that would forever alter the history of Silverwood Crest. Benedict looked across the table at Miriam, his sharp features illuminated by the warm yellow light of the kitchen lantern, his mind entirely clear of any remaining doubts. He announced with absolute certainty that he intended to do something completely different with the massive, empty mansion he had inherited from his ancestors. Miriam tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing in confusion as she asked the vampire king what kind of changes he was envisioning for the ancient estate. He explained that he wanted to tear down the emotional walls of the house, opening its heavy doors not for wealthy aristocrats or political banquets, but for those who truly needed a haven. He envisioned transforming the vast rooms and expansive grounds into a beautiful sanctuary and school for human children who had been abandoned by society or left without families. Miriam remained silent, her expression shifting from confusion to profound astonishment as she listened to the immortal ruler describe a vision filled with genuine compassion. He wanted to create a vibrant environment where young minds could learn, play, and grow without ever having to feel invisible or unwanted by the world. Lily lifted her head from the table upon hearing his words, her eyes shining with excitement as she asked if the house was going to become a magical school for children. Benedict offered her a warm, genuine smile, confirming that it would be exactly like that, but noted that he could not accomplish such a massive task entirely on his own. He looked back at Miriam, stating clearly that he required the assistance of someone who understood the value of human life and maternal love far better than he ever could. Miriam quickly shook her head in a modest refusal, protesting that she was merely a simple housekeeper who possessed absolutely no knowledge of running an educational institution. Benedict leaned forward slightly across the oak table, his pale face earnest as he counteracted her argument by pointing out the incredible job she had done raising Lily completely by herself. He noted that she had worked within the walls of his mansion for years without receiving proper recognition from the wealthy guests, yet her daughter had grown into the most perceptive soul in the city. He emphasized that Lily was the only individual in the entire estate who possessed the ability to see through his royal armor and recognize his deep need for comfort. Miriam felt a powerful wave of emotion rise in her throat, her eyes tearing up at the profound validation of her years of silent, hard work. She whispered that her love for her daughter was simply natural, but Benedict insisted that such natural love was exactly what the cold stone walls of Silverwood Crest had been missing for centuries. He looked into her eyes and extended an official invitation for her to join him in this grand endeavor, not as a subordinate employee, but as an equal partner with full executive authority. Miriam hesitated, her heart racing as she tried to comprehend the immense scope of the offer and the radical shift it would bring to her quiet life. She wondered aloud if she possessed the strength to stand beside a king, but Benedict assured her that they would learn to navigate the path together, step by step. The kitchen fell into a deep, peaceful silence once more, but the atmosphere was no longer filled with the uncertainty of the past. It was alive with the electricity of a shared destiny. Benedict reiterated the word partner, making it absolutely clear that his offer was not an act of pity or charitable arrogance, but a gesture of profound respect for her character. Miriam lowered her eyes as a tear escaped, deeply touched by the realization that her existence had been truly seen and valued by the most powerful figure in the region. She slowly reached out her hand and placed it over Benedict's pale fingers, sealing an unspoken contract that would redefine both of their lives. Lily, sensing the deep emotional significance of the moment, stepped between them and placed her own small hand over their joined fingers, giggling happily at the warmth they shared. In that simple, unscripted moment beneath the kitchen lantern, a new family began to take root within the ancient, Gothic walls of the Newport estate. They did not exchange elaborate vows or sign formal legal documents that evening. The genuine commitment written in their eyes was more than enough to bind their futures together. For the first time in his exceptionally long life, Benedict Montgomery did not look out at the dark ocean with a feeling of empty sorrow, but with a profound sense of purpose. A single year passed over the coastal cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, bringing with it a transformation so profound that no past visitor would ever recognize the halls of Silverwood Crest. The cold, unyielding silence that had once defined the grand estate had been permanently replaced by a vibrant symphony of human life, laughter, and endless activity. On a brilliant spring afternoon, the warm sunlight streamed through the massive ballroom windows, illuminating a space that was no longer arranged for stuffy aristocratic banquets. Instead, long wooden tables were covered with colorful textbooks, art supplies, and musical instruments, while dozens of children moved through the room with absolute freedom. The heavy mahogany doors that had once kept the ordinary world at bay now remained wide open, allowing the fresh ocean breeze and the scent of blooming flowers to circulate through the historic corridors. The mansion no longer imposed a sense of terrifying authority on those who entered its borders. It welcomed them with the open arms of a true sanctuary. Benedict Montgomery stood at the high threshold of the ballroom, leaning against the frame with a look of absolute peace dominating his sharp, pale features. His physical appearance remained as striking as ever, his white hair catching the golden sunlight, but the ancient coldness that once filled his crimson eyes had completely vanished. Out in the expansive green gardens that overlooked the Atlantic Ocean, a group of young boys and girls were running through the grass, chasing colorful kites beneath the clear blue sky. Nearby, several older children sat around an improvised wooden bench, intently practicing the chords of a beautiful melody on a classical guitar under the patient guidance of an instructor. Inside the ballroom, a young girl was sitting at the grand piano, hitting a series of irregular notes as she attempted to learn a simple song without any sense of pressure or fear of failure. Every corner of the once sterile estate was now bursting with the raw, chaotic energy of youth, a sight that gave meaning to Benedict's immortality. Miriam cross-walked gracefully through the busy room, pausing to offer a word of encouragement to a young boy who was struggling with a reading assignment before adjusting a stack of papers. She no longer wore the plain white apron of a housekeeper, nor did she walk with the cautious, defensive posture of a servant trying to avoid the gaze of the wealthy. She moved with the natural confidence of a woman who knew she belonged, her smiles genuine and her authority respected by every child and staff member in the facility. Benedict watched her move with a deep, quiet admiration, recognizing that her incredible heart was the true foundation upon which this entire sanctuary had been built. Over the past 12 months of working closely together, an undeniable, profound romance had quietly blossomed between the vampire king and the mortal woman who had brought light to his dark world. They had spent countless late nights at the kitchen table, discussing the needs of the children, sharing stories of their pasts, and finding a deep emotional harmony that defied the boundaries of their different natures. Benedict had found himself falling deeply in love with Miriam's gentle strength, while Miriam had discovered a tender, fiercely protective soul hidden beneath the king's icy exterior. They did not need grand declarations to validate their bond. It was written in every shared glance and every quiet moment of mutual support. Lily came sprinting into the ballroom from the sunny garden, her simple cotton dress trailing behind her as she carried a brand-new sketchbook clutched tightly against her chest. She spotted Benedict standing by the doorway and immediately directed her high-energy steps toward him, her face alight with the exact same innocence that had saved him a year ago. She reached his side and eagerly opened the sketchbook, presenting a vibrant drawing that depicted the massive mansion surrounded by dozens of smiling children, with Benedict and Miriam standing at the center. Benedict looked down at the artwork, a soft chuckle escaping his lips as he noted how much her artistic skills had improved over the past year of tutoring. Lily looked up at his pale face with absolute seriousness, pointing to the drawing and stating proudly that now no one in the beautiful house would ever have to dance alone again. Benedict felt a familiar, profound warmth expand within his chest, a feeling that had become a permanent part of his daily life rather than a rare exception. He knelt down to her eye level, his white hair falling forward as he softly agreed with her statement, acknowledging that the emptiness of his past had been completely rewritten by her love. The afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the floor and wrapping the entire sanctuary in a warm, protective embrace. Lily took a small step backward, her bright eyes twinkling with a familiar, mischievous energy as she looked at the ancient king and extended her hand just as she had done a year ago. With a joyful laugh, she asked Benedict if he would honor her with another dance right there in the middle of the lively, sunlit ballroom. Benedict looked at her extended palm for a fraction of a second, but this time there was absolutely no hesitation in his heart, nor any fear of what the world might think of his actions. He stood up straight and gracefully took her tiny hand, stepping onto the floor as the distant sound of the children's guitar music provided a perfect, natural soundtrack for their movements. They began to spin slowly beneath the crystal chandeliers, their steps loose and unburdened by the rigid rules of high society waltzes or the judgmental eyes of aristocratic onlookers. Several children stopped their reading and painting to watch the beautiful sight, their faces lighting up with bright smiles as they cheered for their beloved benefactor and his young guide. Lily laughed out loud as Benedict executed a smooth, gentle spin that sent her dress fluttering through the air, her trust in his supernatural strength absolute and unwavering. Miriam paused her work at the far end of the room, leaning against a wooden desk as she watched the two most important people in her life share a moment of pure, unadulterated happiness. Benedict caught Miriam's warm gaze across the busy room and extended his other pale hand toward her, silently inviting his beautiful partner to join them in the center of the floor. Miriam smiled brightly, stepping away from her administrative tasks without a single thought of professional propriety, and walked gracefully into the circle of their small, unconventional family. They moved together in a slow, imperfect dance of mutual devotion, a trio bound not by blood or political contracts, but by a conscious choice to love and protect one another. The children around them began to clap their hands in a rhythmic beat, some joining in by spinning around with their friends, creating a beautiful circle of absolute inclusion. As Benedict guided Miriam through a slow turn, his white hair brushing against her cheek, he realized with absolute clarity that he had finally found the true meaning of his eternal existence. He did not need to conquer new territories, amass greater financial fortunes, or seek the false validation of an opportunistic high society that cared nothing for his soul. The vast emptiness that had haunted his immortal chest for hundreds of years had been completely filled by the vibrant voices, honest smiles, and genuine love of the people who inhabited his home. He looked down at Lily, who was currently trying to teach a younger boy how to properly hold his partner's hand, her small face radiating an absolute confidence that warmed his spirit. The improvised music continued to echo through the historic halls of Silverwood Crest, carrying the beautiful spirit of renewal out over the dark, crashing waves of the Newport Cliffs. There were no uncomfortable silences left within the stone walls, no secretive whispers from envious rivals, and no averted glances born of fear or social cowardice. There was only the absolute, undeniable presence of life in its purest form, a reality built on the foundational truth that every living soul deserves to be seen, valued, and loved without conditions. Benedict held Miriam close as the final rays of the golden sun disappeared beneath the ocean, knowing that his long winter had finally ended, replaced by an eternal, healing spring. True human value is never determined by the immense power we hold, the vast fortunes we accumulate, or the high social positions we occupy in the eyes of a superficial world. Rather, the ultimate measure of a meaningful existence lies within our capacity to extend our hands to one another across the deep chasms of loneliness, fear, and mutual misunderstanding. In a society that frequently prioritizes individual success and external appearances, it is tragically easy to become completely invisible while surrounded by crowds of people who care only for what we can provide. We often build elaborate emotional fortresses to shield ourselves from vulnerability, mistakenly believing that isolation is a valid price to pay for personal security and peace of mind. Yet, as the long journey of our lives unfolds, we inevitably discover that the grandest mansions and the most secure fortresses remain completely empty without the true warmth of genuine human compassion. It requires a rare, profound courage to step away from the safety of our designated thrones and acknowledge our deep, inherent need for kindred spirits and authentic connections. Sometimes, the most transformative moments of our existence do not arrive with the loud fanfare of great achievements, but with the quiet sincerity of a single hand extended without a single hidden agenda. A simple, honest gesture possesses the extraordinary power to shatter the thickest walls of emotional ice, offering a path to healing that no amount of material wealth could ever hope to purchase. When we choose to truly see one another, looking past the superficial labels of age, status, and background, we open the door for a profound alchemy that can transform the coldest stones into a living home. True dignity is never granted to us by the shifting opinions of an opportunistic crowd. It is a sacred quality that emerges whenever we choose to stand beside someone who is suffering in silence. By creating spaces that prioritize unconditional kindness, mutual respect, and emotional honesty, we ensure that no individual is left to navigate the dark, stormy seasons of life in absolute solitude. The ultimate legacy we leave behind is not written in the monuments of stone we build or the empires we rule, but in the hearts we manage to touch, the spirits we help heal, and the love we choose to share with the world. Every soul, without a single exception, deserves a safe haven to call home, a place where their presence is celebrated, their vulnerabilities are protected, and their existence is fully embraced with an enduring, unconditional grace.